Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to Around the Layout, where model railroaders come to tell their story. My name is Ray Arnott, and welcome to our very first podcast. I'm excited to bring you this new show where we're going to talk to a variety of different model railroaders and get to learn their story and what drives them and their passions in this hobby. The first guest on our show is going to be Joe Mammay. Joe Mammay is a model railroader and also a track layout designer. It's become one of his big passions, and I'm excited to talk to him about that and learn a little bit more about that process and also learn about the layout that he's building. So let's get right to it. Joe, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Ray. Thanks for having me.
All right, and great to have you here as we are launching this new podcast. And again, wanted to bring you in because I couldn't think of a better guy to talk about track planning with. You've done a multitude of track plans, not only for yourself, but for others as well. So I want to talk to you a little bit about that, and want to talk a little bit about your start in model railroading and what you've got going on as well. So let's start there. Let's start with tell them a little bit about what you've done in the hobby. Where'd you get started?
Sure. I began in the hobby like many people. I received a train set for Christmas one year. Well, actually, my older sister received a train set for Christmas, just a basic Lupa track, and my dad set it up for her on a sheet of plywood, and she looked at it for 2 seconds and then walked away, and I sat there for the next 4 or 5 hours just watching the thing go around and around. And my dad saw I had an interest in it. So my dad's an artist. So he painted a bunch of stuff on the board. And then basically from there, as I grew up, I got other like small, like train stuff for Christmas, like small, layouts, I'd say, I guess like your usual Tyco, type train sets. And once I hit my 20s and I was in the military, that's where kind of my model railroading really got a little bit more interesting, where I was on my own, I had my own money, and I could really start to work on skills so I could try to make something that looked like you'd see in some of the magazines. And so I did that. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, it's kind of funny that, it started off actually as your sister, and then you kind of picked it up from there. So it really wasn't even a direct intention. It was kind of, picked up from her.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like I said, she was, 3 years older than me, and of course had no interest in it. And I was probably like 8 or 9, and I just loved it. And I don't know, for some reason, I always liked trains. Anytime I saw a train as a kid, I don't know, I was always fascinated by it. So.
Now I know you live now in Brooklyn, Connecticut. Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Sturbridge, Mass, which not too many trains in Sturbridge, Mass, for sure. The only main line we have nearby is the Boston line. And when I was a kid growing up in the 80s and 90s, of course, that was run by Conrail. So anytime we'd go anywhere near the Boston line in one of the nearby towns, I'd always, beg my mom and dad to just stop by the tracks for a few minutes, hoping to see Big Blue running by. And when I was a teenager in high school, me and my friends would go fishing in the town of Brookfield, which was right along the tracks. And I basically only wanted to go fishing there because it was right on the main line. And I was more fascinated by the trains and the track rather than catching fish. So.
Yeah, and that seems to happen when you're into that. I know it's kind of funny, that the kind of the comparisons of the two, though, between, rail fanning and fishing, too, that they seem to be kind of the same idea. A lot of sitting and waiting, and maybe or maybe not you see something. So that's definitely a parallel there. So you got into your mid-20s, you were saying, and you started to do that. Where did you get your start? What did you start building to begin with?
Well, I really, at that time, I was still like fascinated with mainline, the main lines, because that's all I'd ever seen. I never saw like no industrial switching, anything like that. And I knew what happened. I just had no idea how it happened. So I just wanted to see the trains run. So I built a small space, of course, was really hard to come by. I was living in a small apartment at the time once I had gotten out of the Army. And I just built a small 4x5 N scale Lupa track. It was loosely based on a track plan and model railroader called the Wildcat Central, which is basically a loop of track with a hidden staging track and a small switching area. So I built that and got it up and running. And like I said, did 1,000 laps a night pretty much on that, just watching the train go around, doing a little bit of switching here and there, not really knowing how things worked or how to make it more real. Yeah.
So you went from this 4x5 and this N scale layout and whatnot, and I know you've definitely progressed from there. What was kind of the key factor to go into something a little bit more than just kind of, running around, like you say?
Well, again, it was kind of forced by, not really forced, but, life circumstances. I moved back to this area, like the New England area, and space, again, was really limited. My wife and I were living in a very small house, and I couldn't really I really couldn't have that size of a layout, like 4 foot by 5 foot in a small house, because that just did not work, especially with a small child living in the house. So that's when I decided, well, maybe I'll do like one of the shelf layout things that I see like in the magazines all the time. I want to watch the train go back and, go around and around, but I really don't have the room for that. So I was left with probably about a 7-foot section of wall, and I just designed a simple track plan, like switching layout. And I decided to base it on the Providence and Worcester Railroad and the town of Southbridge, which was the town nearby to where I grew up in Sturbridge, where I would see the train tracks, but I actually never saw a train run on there. So I just had a couple small industries, and that's how I kind of started getting into operation. I made up some car cards on like index cards, just a very basic, very rudimentary, like Great Northern boxcar delivered to such and such industry, and where it was from. And I did that on the other side of the card as well, like where it was going to afterwards. So I could kind of like flip the card. Again, this was all stuff that I just discovered like in magazines through reading several like model railroader magazines. I had a nice big collection of those over the years. So.
Sure. So, you kind of picked it up from the magazines. You started to learn a little bit about ops and whatnot and how it works from there, and kind of just did your own thing on a shelf layout.
Yeah.
So, let's talk a little bit about your track planning, because I know that that's one of your passions is the track plans and whatnot, and you've done quite a few. So now, as you're designing this small layout and whatnot, and what really got you into the track planning portion of the hobby?
Yeah, good question. I had a background in like mechanical drafting, AutoCAD, design work. I had a couple jobs right out of high school as a draftsman using like AutoCAD. So I was familiar with drawing, and I always liked to draw as a kid. And it just I'd grab a piece of graph paper, and I just start drawing up like track plans, whether it be just a loop, a track, or a straight track with a couple sidings. And I always found it, fun and interesting to just draw up different track plans for different spaces. And it got a little bit more sophisticated. I bought one of the templates from Atlas, like an N scale template and an HO scale template, so I could have more proportionate size like turnouts and curve radius, instead of just sketching it out freehand and realizing, wow, this really doesn't fit. So I kind of had a better idea of what fit and what didn't. And from there, I got into a couple computer programs from the beginning, like Atlas. Atlas had, it was called Right Track software, I believe. Very basic program, but that was out probably about 15 years ago. And that all had, like all their sectional track pieces and N scale and HO scale. And that's kind of where I really started, like taking off on drawing track plans. I would just draw up random plans. I'd see a plan in a magazine, and I'm like, oh, that's cool. I wonder if I could do that in the track planning program. And I'd just try to recreate what I saw. And yeah, basically I'd just get different spaces available to me over the years, where there would be, we had a small 8x7 shed, and I talked my wife into letting me use that, for a model railroad. So of course, right to the track planning software I went, trying to draw a bunch of different track plans that fit in there. And
so interesting. You said one of your plans was actually in a shed, not even in a building, but an outdoor shed. That's interesting. How'd you make out with that? I mean, there's probably a lot of challenges to putting an HO scale layout or any scale layout, I guess, in a shed. So what were some of the challenges there?
Yeah. Well, some of the challenges were because it was a smaller space, was the size of the door. It was a 3-foot door, and there was also a window on the same side as where the door was, like almost like a full size window. So I had to kind of work around those obstacles. Ultimately, that never really came to be anything. It was just a notebook or a bunch of computer files, of track plans that I drew up for that space.
So it never really made it off the paper, but it was definitely, something that you were planning. And I know, that, sometimes those things on paper don't necessarily come to fruition, but definitely experience. Was that one of your first track plans, or do you remember what your first track plan was that you had created?
Ooh. No, I don't really recall my first track plans that I ever created. I can tell you that some of the earliest influences on my track plans that I really, really liked were an N scale layout back in Model Railroader. I think it was in 1995, called the Carolina Central, and it was on a hollow core door, and it was all done like an Atlas sectional pieces. So for me, that was super easy to recreate in that Atlas track planning program. And for the longest time, I always wanted to build that layout because they also, it included something that many of the layouts don't have. It included a small staging area. It was just one small passing track, but it was out of sight, out of mind, basically. If you were viewing the front of the layout, you couldn't see the small staging track in the back. So it gave you a sense of a real railroad where trains had a place to go to and where they came from. And it also had a small switching area. So for quite a while, I was kind of obsessed with that track plan, and I always wanted to build it, but never had the adequate space to really build it at the time. And that kind of, going back a little bit, talking about all the different track plans that I drew in the programs and why they didn't come to fruition, was because of the reality of my situation. It's so easy to just sit back and add a turnout here, add a turnout there, have a 5-track staging yard and have it a double-ended yard where you have all these, passing sidings and all these industries, when the reality of it, that's a lot of money.
Right.
I mean, you got to figure each turnout costs, let's say, between 20, now up to even $35-$40 a piece. When you start plopping down 3 or 4 of them, the price just goes up, through the roof, just for the track itself and the switches itself. So a lot of that is what I feel kind of hinders a lot of people, and hindered myself in my, early years of model railroading, is just because I can draw it doesn't mean I can actually build it, because I don't have those type of financial means available to me. So that kind of led me to where I've been the past few years, is building smaller layouts, like small shelf layouts, simple layouts with only 2 or 3 turnouts. I was sick of not having a layout. And a lot of my inspiration for that came from Lance Mindheim's blog and his layout design stuff. So a lot of my philosophy is based off of what his philosophy is, where less is more, and do what you can achieve. Sit down, take a look at what you can really achieve with your given budget, your given skill, and your given time. And that's where a lot of the past few years I've spent, like I said, building small shelf layouts with 2 or 3 turnouts. My latest one I built was just a simple 1 turnout layout where I can have operations, at the drop of a hat, where there's no restaging or anything. It's just simple 6.5 inches wide by 8 feet long, one industry. And I can operate whenever I want, as much as I want. And it's all prototypical. There's no puzzles. There's no tricky track work or anything to navigate. It's all prototypical railroading.
I think you've really hit on something there where, within the hobby, there's just so much. It's what makes the hobby really great, that there's so much room for whether you're building a massive building and putting a huge layout in, or in your circumstance where you're talking about putting, small shelf layouts, or your instant on one turnout layout, there's room for everybody, and really room for most budgets. When people think of model railroading, they think of, at times a massive budget, and the things you've hit on, when you start adding turnouts and you start looking at multiple locomotives and so on, I mean, the dollars start to rack up, and not necessarily everybody can't really, always afford that. So there's room for everybody, and room for most budgets by being able to scale down and still be able to enjoy the hobby.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I mean, that's one of the things is, even with like a lower budget, where income's, not, as compared to like what you see in the magazines with all these large basement empires with 40, 50 locomotives, you can have just as much fun, if not more fun, on a small, simple layout. Like I said, I've built a bunch of smaller layouts. I've built a few larger layouts, and this latest one I built, it satisfies like every little operation desire I have to run a train, because I only need one locomotive. I have, it is decoder DCC equipped with a Loc Sound V5 chip, keep alive capacitor. That alone, for that one locomotive, I think the locomotive itself was around $100, and then the decoder another $100, the keep alive capacitor another $30 or $40, and then because I don't possess the required skill to install that, I had to pay somebody to install that. So just for that one locomotive alone, it's almost $300-400 just for that one locomotive. And that's, something that I like to a point I like to drive home is like the reality of it. Just because you have a large basement or a large space to build a layout and you have this vision going around the walls, the reality of that depends on the reality of your budget and the money you have available and the time you have available and the skill you have available.
Yeah. So there's a lot of factors there, not only the money, like you said, the time. And one of the things that, you talked about the large layout versus the small layout, and, there's a lot of trade-off for the large layout. And listen, I've been to quite a few large layouts, and there's some very beautiful layouts. And if you can do it, and you can know that you have the time, you have the budget, and that you're eventually going to get close at least to completing it, that's fantastic. But
yeah.
Again, I would, I think, and I think you would as well, encourage others not to look at that and say that's the only way to get into this hobby. There's so many other ways, and maybe more manageable ways for those that have families and full-time jobs and activities galore with kids and so on, that there's a great way to break in with shelf layouts and, these instant on layouts. So, yeah. And again, like you said, it's a major concern for somebody trying to buy a locomotive, and if they don't possess the skill to do the DCC install, or it's just something they're not interested in doing, it can be rather expensive. Or buying an off the shelf DCC sound locomotive in the neighborhood of $2 to $3 to maybe even more money when you get into a higher level locomotive. But
yeah.
There is a way to get it done, and with that thing, it can be affordable and get you into the hobby without completely breaking the bank.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think another thing that keeps some people on the sidelines is they see something like my layout, where it's just one turnout, one industry. They think that, oh, geez, no, that I'm not gonna do that because I'll get bored with that. I'll get bored, operations, only last 10 or 15 minutes. I get so bored with that. Well, to be honest, finding the 10 or 15 minutes uninterrupted time, super easy. Even if you have a family with a few kids, to be able to just run downstairs or go in the other room for 10 minutes, that type of time is easier to find than, let's say, a half hour or 45 minutes of uninterrupted time. The time that we require to go down, to fire up the layout, get the locomotive running, do a little work in the yard, get out on the line to do some switching. Chances are in that 30 to 45 minutes, there's going to be an interruption of some sort. So finding the time, the 10, 15 minutes is so much easier. And I'd rather get bored with a layout than not have a layout at all. That was another thing that took a while for me to realize and come to terms with, was just because I can't have a super large layout does not mean that I can't actively participate in the hobby. I can go down now, hit the switch and run. I could do that 5-10 times a day if I wanted to. And I'm operating more than, I'd say, 80 to 90% of the people in the hobby by doing that.
Now, you say that the instant on layout that you have now, that I think you said it's a one turnout layout, if I remember you saying it correctly.
Yeah.
About what size is it? I remember.
Yeah, it's only 6.5 inches wide, by 8 feet long. And I do have like a small 15-inch staging cassette just to get a little bit extra car length.
Yeah, so
one extra car length. Yeah.
So with those dimensions, I mean, like you said, you could fit that pretty much anywhere. Somebody with an apartment that maybe has a spare room, or maybe you convince the wife to put it in the bedroom, or the spouse or whoever, and to put it in, whatnot. But at least you're not looking for a massive amount of real estate. So
yeah.
So kind of speaking on that, so for those that are thinking about designing a track plan, and as you're talking about, the things that you like to design, and I know you've designed not only for yourself but others, that you've got somebody out there right now who's been able to make that negotiation to get some real estate from the spouse, and they've been able to claim a portion of their basement, or say a shed, or even a garage, or wherever the layout's going. What are some of the first things that they should start thinking about as they're thinking about this track plan? What are some of the things on your checklist of pre-planning going into this?
Yeah, great question. What I like to do is I like the person to have a little bit of a reality check, to kind of sit back, and instead of thinking exactly like, okay, I want this type of locomotive, I want this, I want that. First, we need to take a look at, what do you want your layout to do? Do you want, like realistic operations? Are you more interested in just rail fanning, sitting back, watching a train go through, scenery? A mix of both. Also, what's your primary interest in the hobby? Do you like building structures? Have you ever built a structure? Do you like scenery? Have you ever built scenery? Operating trains? And other things such as, have you built a layout before? I'm basically trying to get an idea of where the person is at in the hobby, skill-wise, and also ultimately like time-wise, like how much time can they devote to a layout? Because kind of like financially, the time it takes to do stuff, it adds up pretty quick. Many people would like a nice, city or industrial scene, a nice big city or a town scene. But once you start adding up the time it takes to build some of the complex structures and adding multiple structures, the time it adds up so quick. And that one little city block that you want to have, before you realize it, that might take 2 or 3 years to complete, just a small, 2 foot by 2 foot city block. So that's kind of like the thing that I like to do, is kind of keep their reality in check and keep everything in check.
It seems like it's kind of like a get to know a person too as you're doing this. So, and basically in that process, the person building the layout really needs to know themselves and know, it's kind of like a get to know yourself and what your interests are, and, have that kind of check when you go into building a layout.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think part of this, where this comes from with me, is from my own experiences of sitting around a few years operating on other people's layouts, wishing I had my own layout when I had the space right on my wall to put a small layout, but I was, didn't realize what I could do and couldn't do. And another thing where I like to kind of, like you said, get to know people a little bit, that comes from, my mental health counseling background and psychology background, where get to know yourself basically, and know what you can do, and to kind of keep yourself in reality of what's realistic and what's not.
I know personally, when I was, in the preliminary stages of building a layout and had this thought in my mind, and I'm sharing it with my friends and whatnot. And I got some good advice as well. And I don't know if you speak on it, was to go see other layouts and not, before you even decide, it's really good to network yourself out, see who's got layouts in the area and talk to those people and then go see them, and then go see a bunch of them. And I know that definitely helped me. I mean, is that something that you would kind of concur with?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, being fortunate to operate on some of the great layouts throughout this, like the tri-state area, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut, I've been able to see and operate on a bunch of different layouts, see what works, what doesn't work, what I like, what I don't like. And also you get to see like creature comforts too. I mean, the way that somebody constructed the layout, other things such as like the size of like the aisles. If you have a peninsula coming out, is there enough room for somebody and another person to meet or pass by each other, or does one have to stay in an area, let another person walk by, and just see what you're okay with, dealing with, like doing it. You know, you go to operate on a layout and the first time or whatever, it's not that bad. It's whatever. Okay, that's kind of a pain in the butt. I got to keep moving for this guy. But if, you know, eventually that might, if you find yourself thinking like, okay, this is a pain in the butt, this is getting old. So you know that now, okay, I want big aisle widths. Well, with the big aisle widths, there's a trade-off of you're not going to be able to get as long of a mainline run or whatever. So it's kind of like a bunch of like trade-offs, if that makes sense.
Oh, absolutely makes sense. I think what you really hit on, you know, when you go to see a layout, or even when you're thinking about your own layout, thinking about the big picture, right? It's not just the track. It's not just the ops. It's all of that. It's the room, the layout. What do you plan on? If you plan on being a lone wolf, if you just want to run trains by yourself, there's certain things that you don't have to do. But if you're going to have some people over and you want to get into operations, thinking about that level as well. Yeah,
absolutely. And it's how you bring up like being a lone wolf for years, up until like 2007, I was always lone wolf. I never thought that operating with other people would interest me at all. I never had a desire to operate with anybody else. I always was happy with just doing my own thing, getting lost in my own world. And then I happened to go on an open house tour of, I think it was like the NMRA little roadie division or something. They had an open house tour scheduled, and a guy I worked with was also a model railroader. He asked me, he's like, "Hey, you going to the open houses this weekend?" I'm like, "What are you talking about?" And he handed me a flyer and showed me of the open houses. So I'm like, "Oh, okay, awesome. Yeah, I'll go check out some other people's layouts." And once I went and saw a couple of the layouts, and I ended up staying at one layout for I think I was there for the entire day, just because I was so mesmerized the way the layout was operated and the amount of people it operated. I was blown away. I'm like, oh, okay, so this is how it's done. So this is how, like a large model railroad is operated. It's operated just like the real thing. And I found it so fascinating. And I've kind of become obsessed ever since, with operations.
So that really kind of drives that point home of making sure you get out and see other layouts, because it'll be amazed the stuff that you see and how it inspires you to kind of to open your eyes beyond just the simple. I mean, everybody knows the 4x8 run around a circle, and even now it's short, but then you start seeing other ideas and how people have incorporated, multiple other layouts into their own, and everybody's seems to be been inspired by somebody else. So we talk about some of those local layouts. So tell me, what some of the local ones that really have inspired you as far as making plans of your own, and maybe even pieces that you've incorporated into other layouts?
Sure. Well, probably for me, like one of the biggest inspiring layouts I saw was the second layout I saw that morning in 2007, and I spent the whole day there. That was Don Iris. Don Iris's Providence and Worcester Railroad. To me, that was just like the pinnacle and kind of something that I hold to, like, in my mind, kind of like the gold standard of how a railroad should operate, mechanically, operationally. It just, I was fortunate enough. Don let me run a train while I was there. So I put on the headset. I had a DCC throttle in my hand for the first time. I was so intimidated, and I heard all this talking over the walkie-talkie and stuff. And they just Don kind of walked me through with how to operate. He had full signals, CTC dispatching and everything. And he basically told me, just follow the lights like you would in a car. If it's red, you stop. If it's green, you go.
Yeah, so that's simple.
Yep. Yeah, that's basically what I did. And once I did that, like I said, I was hooked. I'm like, wow. It was like, it totally changed my entire perspective. So like you said, getting out and seeing what other people are doing can really, really change your perspective and give you so many ideas. And other layouts that I eventually got to operate on, I got to operate on Mike King's CSX Mansfield Industrial switching layout. That's up in, he lives up in Uxbridge, Mass. He's got a great layout, like in a 15 by 15 room. It's a switching layout, and it keeps 4 or 5 guys busy for like 2 to 3 hours at a time. And that's always a blast. That was a nice inspirational layout. Mark Herrick over in Connecticut. Well, I live in Connecticut now, but I get to operate on his layout, and he had something, like similar to like what Don had, where he has the full CTC dispatching. Everything's computerized, signals, mainline running, like in Montana, the BNSF. And I just, first time I went over there, I don't think he had like barely any scenery done the first time I went over there. But still, I didn't even notice because it was so enjoyable. His operation schedule, the way it made you feel like you were really working on a real railroad. And that just captivated me. And other layouts, I would have to say Anthony Donatelli's layout in Scituate on the Western Maryland. That's set like in the early to mid 50s, and it's coal hauling in West Virginia. And his scenery is like, jeez, it's some deep scenery, it's some tall scenery, and you just feel like you're in the mountains, like you're really there. You're really hauling coal back in the 50s, and it's just like coal train after coal train, freight trains, everything. There's all type of jobs you could want to do. If you're into like switching, if you're into doing yard work, if you want to switch some of the coal mines or mainline running, it's everything. Everything's like encompassed in that layout.
And I'm familiar with the 4 layouts that you had mentioned. And what's amazing about all 4 is, with the similarities, there's also a multitude of differences that really help you learn, that give you a lot of ideas, things that one is done differently from the other, that you can, they're real takeaways as you visit these layouts. So again, for those that are listening that may be, getting into the hobby, it really is. It's imperative to go out. Don't just, the magazines are great. You can read an article. YouTube is full of videos, but there's nothing like being there. And now that we're coming outside of the pandemic era and layouts are starting to reopen again and people are more willing to allow, it really is a great idea. Network with some people, ask, see what's in your area. NMRA's got a listing. There's multitude of other places where you can find where layouts are near you, and go see them. And then take notes, really take a good look at these layouts and bring that back with you, because that'll certainly help with your layout design. Yeah,
absolutely. That's great point. And it definitely opened my eyes, and it made me realize so many different things that I didn't even know existed as in the hobby. And it's great.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about what you've got going on with your track plan, because this kind of ties in with everything. So you've gone from this switching layout, and you've recently moved, and now you've got a nice big piece of real estate to work with, and you've gone through some couple different track plans. So talk us through that process, and when you started and where you thought you were going and where you are actually going now. Love to hear that.
Sure. Yeah. So I am the perfect example of everything that I was just describing. And like when a client comes to me or somebody kind of getting into the hobby, where I'm fortunate now, my wife and I moved into our permanent house, and I have a 22 by 50 foot garage that I've recently insulated and pretty much finished off. And I must have come up with, no exaggeration, probably 30 to 40 track plans for that space. I mean, to me, like the sky was the limit. I've waited my whole life to get this space. Now I finally have it. I can do anything I want. I was basically blinded by looking at the open space and the open canvas as opposed to what I could really do. Like I said, I grew up near the Boston line, and I've always been fascinated with the Boston line. I had probably 20 track plans drawn up of the Boston line, almost switch for switch in certain towns, like Westfield, Pittsfield, Springfield. And again, the reality of it was I would never be able to build that. To operate a layout like that, main line, I would need 30 to 40 large 6-axle locomotives. And again, talking about the cost of that, add that up, it's mind boggling.
Yeah. Oh yeah. That's a lot of money right there just in power. So sure.
Yeah. And, so I'm like, okay, well, maybe I'll scale it back a little bit. Maybe I won't take the entire, garage. Maybe I'll take 3/4 of it, so I can still have a place for my lawnmower, snowblower, little workshop. And again, I ran into the same thing. I had a bunch of different track plans. So many different prototypes came to mind. Norfolk Southern out in Western Pennsylvania on the Conemaugh line. That was a little bit more somewhat achievable because I wasn't going to need as many locomotives or as many, modern auto racks or intermodals. So I thought, okay, that's a little bit more achievable. But again, once I sat down and did the math and figured everything out, it was still out of reach for me. So what I did, I really had to focus myself and realize what I could do and what I couldn't do. As far as like my skill, scenery, building the bench work, I've built enough bench works, burned enough bench work that I know what I can do and what I can't do. So nothing intimidated me as far as bench work. So what I ended up not settling on, but what I found, what really kind of pulled up at my heart, I guess, is overall, my two things in the hobby are scenery and operations. I love realistic operations, and I love creating realistic scenery.
And I know you went through the process as kind of riding along with you as our friends and in the same operating group, of hearing you talk through these processes of, I tease you and I call you open-minded almost to a fault, because you have such a vast love of a multitude of things in the hobby, a multitude of roads, between the Boston line, and I know some others have come into. You talked about Norfolk Southern, you've talked about Alaska, you've had quite a few, and we may make light a little bit, but you love railroading and you love the hobby and you love the prototype, and there's so much to pick from. So yeah, narrowing it down is certainly a challenge. How did you finally get to that point?
How I finally got to that point is I tried to combine other areas of my life, like influences of my life. So I love the outdoors. I'm an avid outdoorsman in the fall. With like hunting, bow hunting. I grew up doing that, and still to this day, 3 months out of the year, I almost ghost you all in the operators group because I'm too busy 20 feet up in a tree looking for deer. So that was kind of the wild, like the mountains, the woods, and that kind of drew me to northern Vermont and a railroad that I became aware of in 2009 probably, was the Lamoille Valley Railroad. And I only became aware of that through another modeler, Mike Confalone, who models the famous the Allagash now. But when he started building his layout back in the early to mid 2000s, he started on a freelance railroad that was based off of a branch line off the Lamoille Valley. And I had no idea about that railroad, but I was always fascinated by the color. As soon as I saw it in the magazines, just the color of like the yellow engines, the lettering, and also his scenery. It reminded me of being out in the woods, in the middle of November, miles away from civilization. Those two things kind of combined really helped me kind of focus on that. And once I did a little bit more research on the Lamoille Valley, I found out that, the paint scheme and everything that I liked was started in 1978. And at that time, they had rebranded as the Lamoille Valley from the St. Johnsbury and Lamoille County Railroad to just the Lamoille Valley Railroad. And they only had 5 engines. They had 5 Alco RS3s. And that was kind of like another light bulb that went off in my head where I'm like, wow, I can afford that. I can, knowing my financial situation, I can afford to have 5 engines, all, DCC equipped with keep alive capacitors. That's realistic for me.
So, and most people, I mean, I know, that it's kind of what you're doing is kind of unique in a couple ways, because there's a lot of people who fall in love with a railroad and then model it. But in turn, what you have done is you kind of found out who you were and then found a railroad to match it. So it's kind of a unique way of kind of going into it.
Yeah, that's a great point. I never thought of it that way. I never even looked at it that way. I just kind of looked at it as like my madness and my struggles with having ADHD.
I think we all have madness, but yeah, that's
yeah. Whereas like the next and brightest and shiniest thing to grab my attention is what I was going to model that week.
Sure.
But yeah, so then once I just realized that, okay, that's what I want to do. That's realistic. I kind of sat down and, got in on my track planning software and started drawing out a couple things and figured out, do I want to model the entire line? The entire line is only 96 miles, from St. Johnsbury to St. Albans, Vermont. And I'm like, okay, let's see what fits, what doesn't fit. And I kind of did, in the same time, doing all kinds of research on the railroad, finding out the industries that were along the line.
I was going to say that because you must have, it must have been a challenge for you because you're modeling a railroad that's been defunct since when?
Well, they finally stopped running, I think sometime in the mid 90s.
So you're talking about a railroad that, has been defunct for quite a while now, 20 years or more. So that must have been a challenge in itself to learn about a railroad you really had never heard about before. Not only learn about it enough to fall in love with it, but enough to be able to model it. So what were kind of your resources for that? How did you go about that process?
That was a little tricky and still proves to be a little tricky. There are a couple really good resources out there. One of them is a Facebook page. I hope I get it right. I think it's just the Lamoille Valley Railroad. And then in parentheses, LVRC, they have a separate page, and that's run by former employees or employee. I know there's at least one. It's run by at least one former employee who's very familiar with the railroad, super friendly gentleman. His name is Dave Poor, and I've messaged him back and forth, and I've asked him a bunch of questions on the railroad, and he's been more than willing to help out and answer questions where he can. I also did a bunch of reading, a couple old magazines from back in the early 80s. Like I think it was Railfan and Railspace or something along Railfan magazine, where they had probably like a 8-page write-up on the startup of the Lamoille Valley Railroad. And that's where I got some important information as far as the locomotives, the color of the locomotives, what exactly color yellow was it, the style of, the font they use, because it's like done like in what's called an Odin font, where you look at it and it's so 70s. I mean,
Right.
like the logo, it's so 70s, and I don't know, I love it. But yeah, that was one of the resources. And also there's a video. I wish I had that information handy, but I downloaded a video, like a 2-hour long video on the Lamoille Valley. I think you can find it by like a simple Google search now.
Sure.
But yeah, that provided a whole background of history, interviews with like former employees, residents who lived around the railroad. And it also, the going back a little bit, kind of bouncing all over here, going back to the magazine, that provided a little bit of like a time frame of the style of the Alco RS3, because a lot of times when people, if you do a Google search of Lamoille Valley, a lot of people think chop nose RS3, with the yellow and green. That actually wasn't done till like 1980, 81 or 82, when they chopped the nose off the RS3. In 1978, when they started up, it was black lettering. They still had the high hood RS3, and they didn't have the stripe going down. And to me, that's what I kind of focused in on choosing when to model that railroad, was right at the startup in March of 1978, when the sky was still the limit, when they still thought that they could really put their stake in the in the real railroad world.
Yeah,
they can make it a huge difference.
So it amazes me is listening to you talk about this, just how much you learned about this railroad in the process, that it really was, you picked it, and then you've learned so much about it, and the information you were able to get. And thank goodness for the internet, where we can have this information right at the tips of our fingers here. So that's an interesting path, to pick a railroad you had no idea. Now somebody else may go and, easily accessible information is the railroad in their backyard or whatnot, but you've chose to go a different path, and you've really, seems like you're going to be creating something very unique than the typical layout. So talk about a little bit about your planning. So you've learned about the Lamoille Valley and what they used to run, and got all that information. So now you're starting to sit down and you're putting a track plan together. What are some of the steps that you started to go through to kind of design something that would match that layout, or the prototype?
Yeah. So some of the things I did, again, I had to really look in the mirror of my available. I basically had to practice what I preach as far as layout designs. I really did. I'm like, wow, maybe I should, like I said, practice what I preach. I mean, I tell people, you really need to do this. And here I was not doing that, the number one thing. So I was able to realize that less is more, basically. Less is more. I think I have about 10 or 12 variations of a track plan for this, for this layout. And most of them were all double deck,
right?
Where I tried to create as much of the main line as possible. But most of the main line, there's not a lot of online switching on the main line. I mean, there is, don't get me wrong, they have quite a few big customers. But one of the things I still focused on with the double deck layouts was open space, where it's just the railroad running through Vermont country and Vermont scenery, because that's how a majority of the railroad was. So that's what I kind of wanted to create. But then I kind of ran into a little bit of a dilemma where, again, I had to look in the mirror, where I wanted of course, I mean, we all want like the longest main line run as possible, but I wasn't willing to sacrifice viewing the railroad, if that makes sense.
Which sometimes can be lost in compression. We talk about compression in layout design, where, we normally it'd be 15 miles between two stops, and you've got to compress that down into a very short area. And sometimes that stuff's lost, but I think what you're saying here is that's stuff that's really important to you, and really important in scenery, to be able to have some of that as well. You don't want town on top of town on top of town. Well, at a little bit of what that, that neutral space, I guess, if to call it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that wouldn't be the worst. Well, half your train is in Boston and the other half of your train's in Worcester. I mean, you kind of lose a lot there when that happens. So you have to really kind of narrow stuff down and take some stuff out. But so what I didn't like about my double deck layout was the viewing height and the viewing angle, where neither deck was going to be at the perfect viewing height, which both you and I have been fortunate to operate on many layouts that are double deck. And when you're operating, you don't even think about that. Once you start operating, the viewing height or whatever, that's not even a thought in your mind. You're focused on what you're doing, the tasks that you're doing. And if there's a train running, like 6 inches above your head or whatever, you're not even really paying attention to that.
Yeah, it's amazing how your eyes go right into where, especially if you're in intense operating, your focus is really right on that section, and really all the rest goes away. And you wouldn't think so when you walk in a room and you see these double deck layouts, and oh my God, they'll be distracted, but you really aren't, because you're just drilled in so close to what you're working on.
Yeah. And for me, for my own personal layout, I wasn't going to be, well, I can't say I wasn't going to be happy. I kind of knew what I wanted when I walk into a room. I'm a big fan of like the shadow box style of layouts, and kind of like how in theater, or when you go to a movie theater, when the lights go down and the movie comes on, all you can see is the movie. So when you go to a theater, you are so into whatever you're seeing. All your surroundings kind of disappear, where you're literally like in the movie or in the show. And that's something I've always liked to do with my small shelf layouts and my railroads, is make it feel like you're really there. And I felt I wasn't going to get that effect by doing a double deck layout, because there was going to be too many things distracting to the eye. If you were standing back like 5-6 feet from the edge of the layout, your eye wouldn't know what to focus on, the upper deck or the lower deck. So that's why I kind of decided I wanted to go with just a single deck, almost at my eye height, at 60 inches, which is pretty high. But again, I wanted the viewer to feel like they're really there. They're really trackside in Vermont, in March. So that's why, I lost double the amount of available mainline and running. But I feel like the overall effect that I gained from that is something that I can live with, and something I'll be happy with in the long run.
So it's, and so you've made a big decision here is about the size of your layout. And, I know some of the other factors as well of deciding on that. That's you're going from, when you originally walked in that room and a plan of this massive layout, and, I'm going to build double deck and I'm going to have all this running and so on. And now you've moved from that down to a simpler layout. What are some of the other factors I know that you and I have talked about to get you back down to a more simpler, this single deck layout versus the double deck, other than that focus? I know there's other things to think about as well.
Mainly because part of me felt a little bit selfish, just a little bit selfish on taking the entire 22 by 50 foot garage.
Sure.
So, what I decided, you and I had actually talked about this, was having room in the garage to actually put a vehicle. I'm not getting any younger. I'm 45. I'm not getting any younger.
Right.
Right now, I'm okay with leaving my car outside in the snowstorm, New England winter, whatever. I can wipe snow off the car. But 10 years from now, it might be a different story. If my health declines, it'll be a pain in the butt having to sweep off 1.5 feet of snow off a car every snowstorm we have. So
Sure.
That's why I'm like, I think I should leave some room in the garage to be able to park 2 cars for my wife and I's vehicle. And plus that'll give me room to store the snowblower, the lawnmower, and have a little bit of a work area as well.
And keep the peace with the spouse, which is a very important part of this hobby that probably we don't speak enough about, right? Keeping the spouse happy and keeping them, on the good side of the hobby, right? Or they're supportive of it and not whatnot. So
yeah,
I know one of the other factors we talked about too is, when you get this layout built, and things to think about, at some point you're going to have to maintain this thing. So you've got this, huge empire of a railroad, and you've got this thing built, and then it's time to clean track. And what kind of time do you want to put into maintaining it for ops or even for your own enjoyment or whatnot? I know that's a factor as well.
Yeah, that's a very important factor. And I'm glad you brought that up, because that was another thing where I had to look in the mirror where, I could probably build it, a super huge layout, but the maintaining of it, of cleaning the track. I mean, it's, even though I have that big brass heavy, tank car, cleaning car that I can push around, do laps on with that thing to clean the track before an operating session, there's so much more that goes into it. I mean, there's the resetting of, like the freight cars or whatever, getting ready for an operating session. And one of the things I had to steer away from was the electronics, like the in-depth electronics of a real signaling system, because I wanted that. I wanted the CTC board, everything. I wanted the remote dispatcher, just like some of the guys have in our group. But after operating for quite a few years, I've seen some of the maintenance headaches that go along with it, where instead of working on scenery, one of the layout owner will have to spend 3 or 4 hours troubleshooting to why a certain signal won't light up, or why the block detector isn't detecting occupancy. So again, I had to look in the mirror and say, would I rather have time spent working on scenery or under the layout looking at wires, as neat as that is, having an operating signaling system? So that was another thing that drew me towards the Lamoille Valley, was they never had signals. They just operated on track warrants, manual block systems, which, like as your layout operates on, Ray, is where you call into the dispatcher and you're sitting there writing stuff down between, you're able to work between control point such and such to control point such and such. And that also slows things way down. So whereas the signaling system, you could easily move 20 or 30, trains across the layout in a matter of like 2 hours, 2-hour operating session. Whereas using track warrants, you're going to be lucky if you can move 5 or 6 across the railroad in that amount of time, just because of how it slows everything down. And again, that was the way the real Lamoille Valley did it. So I figured I'm going to do the same exact thing. And that kind of kills a couple birds with one stone right there.
Absolutely. And getting to know yourself and knowing what interests you. Like, then that's the beauty really of the hobby is, again, there's so much room and so many other outlets within the hobby. Maybe electronics isn't your thing, but scenery is. And so you tip a layout towards what your passion is, whether it be, again, scenery, or, hey, maybe electronics is, and maybe you want all working signals and defect detectors and grade crossings and all these electronic components and so on that really, that drive that passion. So you've been able to do that. You've been able to take a railroad, make it match your passion, found something that matched that, and then built a design around it. So, so where are you in the process? Where are you at building this now that you've decided, what your track plan is going to be, and you're heading forward? So where are you at?
Where I'm at, I decided on a space, first world problems. Now my overall space for my layout is 30 by 22. So I had put up the wall. I studded up a wall to make it permanent. Like, this is what I got. This is what I have to deal with, kind of like to control myself. So I got it all insulated. I have the walls up in about 80% of it. And I've actually started building some of the bench work on the section where the wall is up. So I started building some of the bench work where it's only about a foot deep. I have that going around about 2.5, almost all 3 walls. I have the bench work going around there. It is like a serpentine peninsula style of a layout where it kind of goes out like on one peninsula, then wraps around itself, which is a neat little trick to get a little bit more running room. And the deepest spot for scenery is going to be where I'm going to have the freelanced paper mill. That's probably going to be about 3 feet in width, which is a little wide, but I plan on having a really large structure there.
Excellent. Excellent. So I'm looking forward to having you back on the show. We'll definitely get some more updates from you as you progress through your layout build, and you've definitely got a great space there. I've been fortunate to come up and see the space in person, and look forward to seeing what you're able to create in that really awesome spot you've got. All right, so Joe, we're going to wrap this up here, and as we do that, I want to ask you one thing. We got somebody listening to the show who's about to start their layout and is really starting to think about this. What would be the one big piece of advice that you could give to that person?
That's a great question. I would have to say less is more. That's my honest advice, is less is more. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. You'll have more enjoyment in the hobby if you can actually complete something and see a train run, or to operate, to switch, whatever you want to do. Just focus on less is more to expedite the process of building the actual layout.
Excellent. And if they're thinking about, well, I'm not really a good track layout design guy, but I really want to talk to somebody that knows what they're doing, and they wanted to talk to you about your services, what's the best way for them to get a hold of you?
Sure. The best way they could get a hold of me is probably by email. My email address it's my last name, Mammay, which is M as in Mike, A as in Apple, M as in Mike, M as in Mike, A as in Apple, Y as Yankee, 76@msn.com.
And we'll put that email in the show notes as well. So if anybody wants to get a hold of Joe, Joe is really the resident expert when it comes to putting together a track plan. He's worked with a multitude of people. He's actually drawn mine even after it was built, and he's done it for a multitude of people within the group that we operate, and does a phenomenal job. And we'll give you the base to start with. And boy, he's going to ask you some good prodding questions to get you focused on what you really want to do and what you want. So, Joe, thanks for being on the show, and we look forward to having you back soon. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Around the Layout. You'll find more about today's show on our Facebook page, facebook.com/Around the Layout. Learn more about the show and check out past and future episodes on our website, aroundthelayout.com. And send us your feedback. We'd love to hear from you. aroundthelayout@gmail.com. Thanks again for hanging out with us around the layout.